Joe Galvin.
Welcome, everyone. I'm Joe Galvin, Chief Research Officer at Vistage Worldwide. I'm happy to host the latest webinar in our Peak Performer webinar series. This series is designed to support your leadership climb by bringing the most trusted experts to the Vistage community. Experts who provide exceptional insight and best practices, helping you navigate new challenges and possibilities. Joining us today to look more closely at creating or updating your own diversity, equity, and inclusion strategy is Vistage speaker, Adeniyi. Andrew has over 10 years of executive level management experience in retail operations, where he dealt with a wide range of business scenarios. He's passionate about entrepreneurship, organizational culture, business strategy, diversity, equity, and inclusion. With years of experience running his own consulting firm, Andrew's helped dozens of clients amplify their potential. He strives to empower and equip leaders with the resources and tools necessary to win. Andrew published his first book titled The Circle of Leadership in summer of 2020. The book serves as an entrepreneurial framework on how to create and leverage culture. We are delighted to have him with us today. Andrew, welcome. I am so looking forward to learning from you and hearing your thoughts and experience on diversity, equity, and inclusion. It's such an important topic in our community that doesn't get the attention it deserves with all the other things that are going on, but we're excited and greatly appreciate you spending time with us today.
No problem at all. Thank you so much for the opportunity. Super excited to be with you all today and talk about one of my favorite topics, which is diversity, equity, and inclusion. And we're going to talk about how you can craft or elevate your DEI strategy. So I'm the CEO and founder of AAA Solutions. We provide coaching and consulting and training around diversity, equity, and inclusion and workplace culture. So we'll go ahead and dive right in. My background is mainly in retail operations leadership, and I've done independent consulting for the last 4 or 5 years. And a lot of the topics that I speak about can be found in my book titled The Circle of Leadership. If you couldn't tell by my polo I have on today, I am a Big Ten supporter. So go green for those of you who support. I went there for my master's, studied management strategy and leadership, and then for undergrad, went to the Kelley School of Business. So very much a Hoosier as well. Studying entrepreneurship there. You have a certificate in DEI in the workplace. So I really am able to leverage all 3 of my educational experiences and my professional experience to be able to have this conversation with you all today. The objectives for today are simple. It's not about me, it's about you. And we want to define some key terms as it relates to DEI to ensure that we're on the same page around what these things even mean. And then we want to determine how to elevate or create your DEI strategy. And lastly, we're going to talk about crafting a compelling purpose and set of SMART goals for diversity, equity, and inclusion in your organization. So before we dive in, do have a brief poll that we want to share with the group here. And the question is, do you have a DEI strategy in your organization? The answers are yes or no. Go ahead and cast your vote just to get an idea for what % of people on the call are part of an organization that already has a strategy in place. I think this will be helpful as we're going throughout the rest of this conversation. So I'll give you a few moments to cast your vote. Do you have a DEI strategy in your organization? Yes or no?
You know, Andrew, just to jump in, we asked this question every year in our December survey, and we saw a jump from 2019 to 2020. But diversity and inclusion is a key part of our talent developmental strategies. Almost 40% answered yes to that question. So we've seen again, we saw a surge from 2019 into 2020 and held into 2021 as people get a little more serious about this.
Very good. Thank you for sharing that. Really appreciate that. If we have the results from the survey we just did, let's go ahead and post them. All right, so we had about 22% of folks on this call identify as yes, you have a strategy, and 78% shared no. So thank you so much for casting your vote. There's no problem whether you have a strategy or not. You have to start somewhere, but it starts with awareness, and we're going to dive into how you can change that so we can have more than 22% on this call that have a strategy moving forward. So let's dive right in. Let's start defining diversity, equity, and inclusion. So let's start with diversity. I want you to pause for a second and just think about what diversity means to you. What comes to mind when you hear diversity? When you think about diversity, what is the definition? What does that look like? One of the main things I like to talk about when it comes to diversity is the value of diversity is diversity of thought. When you have people who think differently, you minimize the blind spots that you have. And in business, you make better decisions. That is what we're talking about when we talk about the value of diversity. But when you talk about defining diversity, it's a numbers game. It's really just a way to categorize human differences. That's what we're talking about when we talk about diversity. One common misconception that I hear about diversity is that it's only race or it's only gender, but there's so many different aspects of diversity that we oftentimes overlook. Formerly incarcerated, first generation college students, right? Veterans. Of course, you have sexual orientation, some of the more popular ones, but there's a lot more aspects to diversity than what we typically think about. So I want to encourage this group to, when you think about diversity, understand the value comes from the diversity of thought from people who have different experiences and look differently as well. When we talk about equality, now the E in DEI is for equity, but it's very important we touch on equality as we're defining these topics. What is equality? What comes to mind? Think about that. When you hear equality, what comes to mind? Oftentimes, when you hear equality, it may be in terms of gender. Maybe it's a men versus women or male versus female situation. A lot of times we hear discussion on equality around pay. So we know that women still get paid less than men for doing the same exact job. So that's a lot of times when we hear equality come up when we're talking about DEI. But from a definition standpoint, it's just the state of being equal, especially in status, rights, opportunities, and race. Okay, it's just about being equal. When we talk about equity, we're talking about being fair and impartial. So whereas equality is the same across the board, equity is not a one-size-fits-all approach. It's all about removing obstacles. Think about what comes to mind when you look at this image on the screen. There's a bunch of things you may notice. Maybe you notice the ladder on the right-hand side is taller. Maybe you notice that there are more apples towards the left side of the tree than the right side of the tree, right? The people who are picking the apples are picking them at different heights and on different sides. There may be other things that come to mind as well. But when we talk about equity, what we're talking about is giving custom tools and resources to your team so they can win. All right, so let's look at an example of the difference between equity and equality, right? So if equality means the same, it means equal, and equity means custom or tailored, what you have here is an image that depicts the difference between the two. Equality is, hey, the goal for today is to observe the game. Our goal is to watch the game. So we're going to make it an equal playing field, and we give everyone the same resources. In this example, it's a stepping stool, so you can accomplish the objective, which is watching the game. But what happens here? This little guy here, does this resource help him accomplish the objective? No. Person in the middle, does it? Yes. Person over here? Yes. An equitable approach to this would be, hey, this individual actually needs no additional resources or support to accomplish the objective or task at hand. This person needs a little bit of support in the middle. And on the far right, the little guy actually needs some additional support than maybe some other team members. And I'll give you an example. I had a client who had an employee who left the company. After he left the company, he had an accident and became visually impaired, almost 100% blind. Well, he wanted to come back to work at that organization. So my client reached out to me and we're working through how to make that happen. And ultimately, there's some equipment, some resources that individual now would need to do his job. The same job that the person next to him may not need. Maybe it's a special keyboard. Maybe it's a special type of monitor, right? But you have to ask yourself as a leader, what is the goal? What am I trying to get my team to accomplish? What's the objective at hand? And what custom tools or resources may they need to do that job? I think a lot of times leaders are all about, hey, we want to make sure it's fair so everyone gets the same thing. What you're actually doing is you're putting some people at a disadvantage by not giving those individuals some custom resources. So this is a very important distinction to understand the difference between equity and equality. So I know there's an opportunity to submit questions. A lot of times I'll get questions on this topic here. So feel free to submit those questions and we'll pause as we go on if there's any question that pertains to this.
Yeah, Andrew, I'd like to jump in because we've gone through in Vistage, we've gone through all the DEI training, and we got caught up on this a little bit because the notion of equality, that we're all equal, versus equity, there has to be a balancing of resources, is one that people find difficult to really get their heads around. Is there another way you can think of to describe that so we can really get a clear separation? Because I found the distinction of these two topics are really important.
They're extremely important. So let's think about it through the lens of the workplace, right? If you're a leader and you need to ensure that people can do their best work, you've got to be asking yourself, what does this individual need to be able to do that? So with this example here, if we're talking about watching the baseball game, as a leader, you should be thinking about not how can I give everyone the same thing to accomplish that task, but what does each individual need to accomplish that task? If we shift the question that we're asking ourselves, we're going to be able to create a more equitable approach to solving that problem as opposed to equality. There's some instances where equal is important, right? So maybe it's a situation where you're realizing two people in your organization, similar experience, are making drastically different amount of money. And there's not a geographical element or some other component that influences that. Okay, you may want to make that equal. Right? So in that example, that's an example where equality could work. But when we talk about equity, the key thing for the group to understand is we're talking about custom tailored approaches that remove barriers for your team to do their best work. Excellent question. Continue to submit your questions as well. We can address that further if we still have some people out there who want further explanation. Let's talk about inclusion. So we talked about diversity, the range of human differences, how we can categorize different groups of people, and how we're trying to get diversity of thought. We touched on equality and equity and the difference between the two. But what does inclusion mean? Think for a second on how you define inclusion, what inclusion feels like to you. When we talk about inclusion, it's truly a feeling. It's a feeling of trust and belonging. And when you think about inclusion, I want you to think about somebody being involved, somebody feeling empowered, somebody being able to participate. That's what we're talking about when we talk about inclusion. It's truly recognizing the inherent worth and dignity of all people. So if diversity is just what makes us different, inclusion is how you bring that all together to make something more beautiful. Something beautiful that you couldn't do if we were just fragmented and separated out by diversity alone. That's why diversity initiatives have to be coupled with inclusion to ensure you get the best out of the differences that we all bring to the table. When we talk about what does DEI done right look like, this is a question I get often. How do you know you're knocking it out of the park with your DEI strategy? How do you know you're fostering that sense of belonging? And at the end of the day, the goal is to have a culture where diversity of thought is encouraged and where you foster a culture of belonging. So if you look at the intersection of these three circles here, really the sweet spot of a DEI strategy is a culture that creates a sense of belonging. When you have an organization that fosters a culture that has a sense of belonging, you have an organization that engages the full potential of your workforce. These firms are able to have innovation at higher levels, and the views, beliefs, and values are ultimately integrated well when you have that sense of belonging. So the answer is, what kind of belonging or sense of belonging does your organization have? And how do you encourage and embrace and value a culture of diversity of thought? There's a quote by DEI strategist and speaker Arthur Chan, and he summed up DEI really well. And he said, diversity is a fact, equity is a choice, inclusion is an action, and belonging is an outcome. So when you're thinking about what DEI means, this is what I want you to take with you in terms of defining that. So before we talk a little bit about the value proposition of diversity, equity, and inclusion, just want to pause for a second, make sure there's no questions that have been submitted thus far. Anything for it?
Nothing yet, but go back to that chart, please, for a minute, would you?
Yeah, no problem.
Can you just break this down a little bit more? This is the one before, the one after that, with the four elements. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Can you break this down a little bit? This really captures it in a very unique and succinct way.
Absolutely. So when we talk about diversity as a fact, this is how you see yourself, how you identify, your background, your experiences. Are you male? Are you female? What's your sexual orientation? Are you first generation, right? These things are facts. These things are you can, you are or you are not. So diversity is just a fact. It's a way to categorize ourselves. When we talk about equity, you have to make a choice as a leader to say, you know what, I'm going to make sure I remove barriers and obstacles that prevent my team from doing their best work. That's a deliberate, intentional choice. Otherwise, the default tends to be equality, which in some situations work, as we talked about, but in other situations, they don't provide a fair and just work environment. So that's why equity requires intentionality and a choice. From inclusion, this is one of those situations where you have to be able to not only invite somebody to the table, have a seat for the table, have them take some ownership in what is discussed at the table, and empower them to take the appropriate action after that conversation. So that's an action of saying, hey, we see you, we value you, and we respect you. So we are going to invite you in and empower you to be able to leverage what you bring to the table. And then at the end of the day, what does that lead to? It's belonging. So sometimes people say, well, I see DEIB and I see DEI and DNI, and what's the difference? Belonging is the outcome. If you do DEI right, you'll have a culture of belonging. Great question. So let's dive into the value proposition. Why does this matter? We define the key terms. Okay, we understand, we get it, but why does it matter? The question you have to ask yourself is, if a good DEI strategy creates a sense of belonging, what are the implications for not feeling a sense of belonging? If your team doesn't feel that, what are the ramifications? Well, if you look at 2021, some statistics from Society of Human Resource Management, they found that over 47 million workers quit their job, an average of nearly 4 million each month. So 2021 holds the highest average on record, topping the 2019 numbers of 3.5 million. So turnover, people are leaving their job. And one of the main reasons they're leaving their job is because they're not feeling valued and they're not feeling a sense of belonging. Harvard Business Review did a study last year, and they shared that almost 50% of employees are planning to leave their jobs within the next year. A main majority is because of not feeling a sense of value, not feeling valued by their employer or their leader, and not feeling a sense of belonging. So imagine if 50% of your team left tomorrow, left within the next week, the next month, the next 3 months, right? There's real business implications for not having a strategy that addresses your team having a sense of belonging. And DEI can fill that gap. And at the end of the day, if there's no sense of belonging, your team's not engaged. And what do we know about that? Well, Wiley did a study and they found that only 18% of workers surveyed were satisfied with their work-life balance. And workers who left the company did so because they said they did not feel like they were valued or that they belonged. So how engaged were those individuals who felt like they weren't valued or that they didn't belong? You think about productivity. The lost productivity of not engaged and actively disengaged employees is equal to 18% of their annual salary. So I love to talk about some of the turnover numbers and retention numbers, because when you talk about investing in DEI, it has legitimate business outcomes, both in productivity and retention are some of the main ones where you can actually save money if you launch a strategy against this. So when you don't have a sense of belonging, you're not engaged. There's tons of studies that have been done on the value of diversity. Here you see some talking about just women in general, right? So if you look at this statistic here from Diversity Best Practices, they showed that a 1% increase in gender diversity, just a 1% increase in gender diversity has proven to result in a minimum 3% increase in sales revenues. If you look at this statistic to the right of that from Catalyst, they shared that companies with women CEOs experience a 50% increase in stock and a 25% increase in the S&P 500. You can see some of the statistics on the left-hand side about companies with at least 3 women directors, 66% return on capital investment, 42% increase on return on sales, and 53% increase on return on equity. And this is just based on gender and women. When you look at all the different aspects of diversity, organizations do well when they create an environment of psychological safety where that diversity can be leveraged because it's valued and it's embraced. So the question here is, how does a diverse, equitable, accessible, and inclusive workplace lead to better organizational performance? Well, we talked about some of this, right? Of course, you have the engagement piece. You have the retention piece. There's also the recruitment piece. right? 10 years ago, you have people going through the interview process. They may not ever ask a question about diversity, equity, and inclusion, or social justice in general, or how your firm showed up in the wake of a particular incident that happened in the media. But in 2022, you have people that will ask that. They want to know what you did in the wake of the George Floyd murder. They may ask, do you have a DEI strategy? Do you have any type of programs that foster a sense of belonging? So it's very important for leaders to begin thinking about this and crafting out what is your strategy, what is your stance, because it ultimately impacts your organizational performance.
Andrew, if I could jump in again, one of the drivers that we see, you talked about all the people that have quit and the challenge of retention. It's been called the Great Resignation, but it's really the big upgrade, is that with the demand for workers at all levels being so high, that people can now find a place that is more consistent with not just what they want to do, but how they want to do it and what they want to be a part of. So your D&I strategy becomes not just a magnet to hold people to a culture they feel connected to, but it also becomes a magnet to attract people who want to be part of something like that. And your culture will radiate what it naturally radiates. The question as a leader is this a conscious culture on your part to be inclusive, to be diverse, to embrace these principles, or is it not? Because it'll show up in the type of people that you can retain and attract.
Absolutely. You are spot on. So if you're looking for a competitive advantage, if you're looking for a solution, a new way to approach your people-related problems or opportunities, look no further than a good DEI strategy. So there's a problem, though, before we dive into how we can create this strategy. A lot of diversity programs are not working. There's a study done by Boston Consulting Group, Matt Krentz, who was leading their global DEI initiatives, and they found that 96 to 98% of large companies have diversity programs. But what they found was that 75% of the employees surveyed saw the diversity programs in place, but felt absolutely zero effect. Think about the wasted time, the wasted energy, the wasted resources, the wasted meetings that went into creating some type of diversity program only for it to not work. So you think of, well, why? Why is that? Well, there's a disconnect between what underrepresented groups want and what organizations are ultimately providing. Part of their research that they did found that if you just look at a couple of different categories of diversity as an example, women, for example, the reports showed that they want career and family flexibility, a visible role model in the leadership team. It's important. When you look at minorities, they talked about their top obstacle being advancement, not being able to rise through the ranks, critically important to them. If you look at the LGBTQIA community, they want an inclusive environment. They don't want to have to show up to work and leave a large portion of themselves at the door. Maybe you have a dog at home. Imagine coming to work and you can't let your team members know that you own a dog. Near and dear to your life, big part of who you are, how you identify as a dog owner. But because of the culture in the organization, you have to leave that at the door and you can't share that when you walk in. People in that community, time and time again, mention they want to have an inclusive environment where their authentic self can show up. So when you think through what some of these different groups want, then you can be able to start crafting, okay, what solution will help alleviate this, will help target this. So now we're going to talk about elevating or creating your DEI strategy. There's a few foundational things that have to be in place for a DEI strategy to work, okay? Number one is leadership commitment. If you are the senior leader in the organization, the senior leader in the department, you're in the HR team, right? If it is not important to you, the team will notice that. They will see that. And once they realize that it's just lip service, it's just checking a box, you can arguably have an even worse impact on DEI in your organization than if you did nothing at all. Because then they're going to think that you're just doing it just to check the box and not because you truly value DEI in the workplace. So leaders have got to be committed. I always recommend to my clients, I typically will draft the talking points for my clients and then have the CEO or president send out all communication to the team as it relates to DEI. That in itself can show importance and prioritization around DEI strategies just by having your senior leader be the one who sends out those messages. You have to have anti-discrimination policies. There's got to be repercussions in your organization for people who are unethical and who are discriminated against people in protected characteristics, right? You have to have repercussions. Again, it lets people know that DEI is important. in your organization. You have to have training. You don't know what you don't know. Things are evolving consistently, whether it's what does Black Lives Matter mean? Or what are pronouns? I don't understand that. Or what's unconscious bias or implicit bias? And what are all these different terms mean? We have to have training, ongoing, reoccurring, regularly attended training for the organization to ensure you're successful. You have to think about your language and resources. There's studies out there that talk about the percentage of women who will not even apply to a job based on the verbiage used in a job description compared to men. If we meet 50% of the category of the requirements, close to 100% of men will still apply to that role. Versus women, they need to meet 100% of the categories to even want to apply. And even then, it's only roughly 60% from the last research that was done on that. So you have to think about what words are you using in your job descriptions? What does your website look like? What are the qualifications? What are the requirements? All those things matter because words matter. And then ultimately, you have to have a tailored approach. Every organization is going to be different, right? I had a client who they worked in a field where they could not hire people who were formerly incarcerated. So that may not be an underrepresented group that you target for your organization based on your industry or whatever it is that you may do as a business, right? So the key there is understanding that not every organization is going to go at DEI the same way. It's got to be a tailored approach. And then there's got to be metrics that matter. There's got to be a scoreboard. We got to be keeping track of how we're doing, and we have to consistently share that with the rest of the team. So before we dive into the DEI roadmap that helps you with crafting a strategy, any questions so far? Anything pop up yet?
Yeah, a question, Andrew, a question that I had was when you're talking about all the reasons why you want to do this, I keep thinking about the worker. Either the worker that's working today or the worker who's born. They have so many choices. Everybody is hiring. Everyone is looking for a big upgrade. So you can't take this is not an or strategy, it's an and strategy, right? Getting referrals is a great way to get employees, but you get people that are like them versus how do you get outside of that circle of what we are to get people who are not like us? Because to your point about diversity, the value is having different experiences coming from different life perspectives that strengthen ideas and strengthens culture.
Yep. The goal is to, and I love that you talked about the hiring piece too. The goal is to have a diverse candidate pool to choose from for positions. You are not trying to hire people only because of that they're Black or only because they're a woman or they identify as X, Y, and Z. That's not what we're getting at. What we're getting at is ensuring that the candidates you're choosing from is diverse. And in order to do that, you've got to go to different places than you typically go to. All right, you have to fish in different ponds, not lower your standards, because that's also a misconception that I've heard before. We don't want to lower our standards in order to get diversity. You should not, and you do not have to, but you may have to go to a different place to recruit those individuals.
Well, Andrew, it's interesting that 67% of our community said the reason, one of the primary objectives of their DE&I strategy was attract and retain people. That you need to be able to add this to your portfolio of attraction strategies to get people because the talent wars aren't going away anytime soon.
Yep, absolutely. Thank you so much for sharing that. So let's dive in. There's really three main components of the DEI roadmap, and then you have a follow-up piece at the end. But let's dive into the first step. It's DEI audit. So when we talk about a DEI audit, it starts with casting vision. Why does DEI matter in your organization, and what are you trying to go after? As a leader, this is one of the first things you have to land at before you launch a DEI strategy to ensure that the team understands what are we trying to accomplish and why. You want to draft employee talking points. So this is verbiage that will go out to the team internally, but you also want to have an externally facing solution as well instead of talking points. This is where you start generating some momentum from a recruitment standpoint to start letting the world know, hey, we're taking DEI seriously, and this is how we're initially trying to go after it. If you have existing data, demographic data on your organization, perfect time to review it. If you don't have it consolidated in a nice way, that's perfectly fine. This section within the roadmap is designed for you to create those survey questions and essentially send those survey questions out to your organization to be able to get not only employee sentiment around things like belonging, fairness, diversity, but also to collect some of that demographic information. Now, it's always self-disclosed, and it is not mandated that you disclose any of those demographics. There's always should be an option on the audit for somebody to put prefer not to disclose. But it's very important for you to do an audit and collect this information, because what happens is if you don't do this and you do all these different activities and you don't see the results that you're looking for, well, we don't have a benchmark to go off of. We don't have data to say this is where we started in October of 2022. In October of 2023, this is the strides we've made when it comes to diversity. So it's super important. You also want to assemble a DEI committee. This should be a cross-functional internal team that has executive level sponsorship and support. Executive level sponsorship or support means somebody who either reports to the CEO or is the CEO should be on this committee. I want to make clear they do not have to lead this committee, but they do need to be on the team, on the committee, and be a part of the meetings. What this allows for is for more effective dialogue within the committee and to be able to have that senior leader person to remove any obstacles for letting the team accomplish the goals that they're trying to accomplish. So that's the DEI audit portion. That typically takes 1 to 3 months, depending on how frequently that committee will meet, and also just how long it takes for people to submit those surveys and to review those surveys.
Andrew, just to jump in on that audit piece, if I'm nowhere, or if I just got a fledgling thing, it's obviously not going to take 1 to 3 months. But if I'm involved in it somewhere, is it a different approach if I'm somewhere in the process, I've already launched this, versus I'm just getting started?
So if you already have data on hand and it's already segmented into various components of diversity, age, generation, sexual orientation, geography, right? If you already have that information, then use that data as a DEI committee to start crafting your goals. What do you want to go after and why? What I find is a lot of small businesses don't have that data, or if they do, it's not readily available or consolidated in a way where they can make use of it. That's why I always recommend starting with an audit.
Okay, thank you.
Very good question. Then we move into the DEI analysis and brainstorming. Here we're reviewing the results. What is the organization saying, right? What should be our plan of action after reviewing the results? And then you want to get to at least 2 to 3 DEI goals, and you want to be as far out as possible. A lot of times I have small business owners where they'll start out with 1-year goals and then they'll expand from there. I think that's fine, but the goal is, hey, this is going to be somewhat of a culture shift or a culture add for your organization, and that takes time to truly get done. So you want to have those goals set out as far as you can, but have some other incremental goals along the way and try to get some goals down on paper. You want to continue to have those monthly or bi-weekly meetings with the DEI committee. I recommend bi-weekly or monthly because if you do bi-weekly, for example, and you miss a meeting, it's only been a month since the last time you spoke. Whereas if you have quarterly meetings, if you miss a quarterly meeting or every other month meeting, now you've gone months before you've met as a committee. So I think monthly or bi-weekly is a sweet spot. Some people don't have the capacity for bi-weekly. That's fine. I would strongly recommend monthly in that case, and 1-hour meetings should be sufficient if we have good enough agendas and leadership for that committee. And really that committee is just, they're designed to activate on the goals. We use data to inform the goals that we create, and this cross-functional team helps us try to accomplish the goals that we agree to. And from there, it's all about strategic planning for complete integration and execution of your strategy. So really creating a strategic plan on how you want to go after DEI. Now, it's very important to have at minimum quarterly updates, DEI updates that you can share internally and externally. What this does is let the group know, hey, remember we sent out that survey? These are the results from the survey. We may not be where we need to be, but that transparency will build trust. And that trust will allow you to help better recruit and retain talent, right? It's one thing for somebody to be in the interview process and they say, hey, I realize there's no women on your senior leadership team. You know, why should I think this is a place where I can come and excel? And although you may not have that diversity today, by being able to say, well, we acknowledge that we have some opportunities there. This is what we have done. We've gotten a committee together. We've hired an outside consultant, or we've nominated somebody internally. We've set some really stretch goals for improving diversity, and we're in the process of making that happen. That could be the difference from somebody saying, you know what, They may not be diverse today, but they got a plan, and I'm willing to roll the dice on them, as compared to not only are they not diverse, they can't even concretely tell me what they're doing about it. You're probably going to lose that diverse candidate.
Andrew, that connects back to a point you made earlier in a question that just came in from a few slides back that says, you mentioned about being aware of acceptable language in job descriptions, website, et cetera. Sometimes I feel this is a changing environment. What are some of the resources to stay current? So specifically, you said there are some, women won't respond to a certain type of ad. When you know what you're targeting is one thing, but what are some resources people can look for to help them?
Yeah, so and we can send this out after the fact too, to make sure people have the link, but there's resources out there where you can literally copy your job description. You could paste it within a section, and it'll literally spit out a score to say, hey, this is 70% skewed towards women, or you have very male, masculine dominated verbiage in this description that may cause some women to shy away from applying. And some of those platforms are free. So you could even just search, biased job description resources, and you can literally copy that and paste it. That's probably the easiest way for you to just make some tweaks to your job description to ensure you're using correct verbiage. But we can certainly send out some resources as well after the fact, so you guys have some links that you can click on.
Great, thank you.
Yeah, no problem. Any other questions so far with the DEI audit phase or the DEI analysis and brainstorming phase? All right, so next we have DEI implementation. So at this point in the roadmap, you should still be meeting as the DEI committee, working on accomplishing those goals. And now you want to start establishing relationships with organizations that promote underrepresented groups. So a lot of times I'll hear clients say, hey, we want to improve diversity. Okay, well, let's first look at your culture. Let's look at what programs you have in place. Let's look at your verbiage. Let's look at your website. Let's look at some of the things we already have to ensure you have a culture that's ready for diverse talent to come. I always say it's not hard to get diversity, it's hard to retain diversity. So getting that culture intact before you partner with people is important. But part of diversity is going to be connecting with organizations that literally have a member base of what you're looking for. Maybe you realize you don't have any veterans in your organization, or it's below the community that you serve or the geographical locations that you occupy. You may have a goal to, hey, we want to increase veteran representation within our organization. One of the ways to do that is partner with organizations that have veterans, that have a mission and vision and set of core values that align with your organization. And you start to foster a relationship, a mutually beneficial relationship where you're pouring into that individual or that organization, and that organization is also supporting you as well with diversity, marketing, awareness, or whatever other goals that you may have. So establishing those relationships are super important. You want to continue to have training sessions. I recommend quarterly. That seems to be an appropriate frequency just to make sure you're covering some of those key topics: psychological safety in the workplace, emotional intelligence, an intro to DEI, to even talk about what these terms even mean, even down to more specific topics as well, where it may be pronouns or certain biases around certain underrepresented groups. Some of the more specific content, you can get to that as well after you've done some of the foundational quarterly training sessions. We talked about anti-discrimination policies a little bit ago. You've got to have them and make sure that they're consistently followed, and also advertised to remind the organization that we take DEI serious and we take well-being serious, and we value our people so much that we will not tolerate any behavior that doesn't fall in line with our values. And then I recommend setting quarterly DEI pulse checks. So what these serve as is really just benchmarks to almost get a ticker on how does the organization view the work that we're doing. Do they see progress through the different things that are being sent out from the senior leader, through the committee and them sharing the goals that they have, the progress that they're making? Do people feel more sense of belonging, or do they feel like the organization is truly taking action against this? It's very important to gauge employee sentiment around progress by using those pulse checks. And then you want to continue to work to remove bias from evaluation and promotion decisions. And this is where you get into some more specific things of tracking, hey, based on these different demographics, are people getting promoted at different frequencies or rates? as other people? Are people getting paid appropriately based on different demographic data? And this is a little bit more advanced in your DEI journey, but as you're reviewing everything in your organization and looking at it through a DEI lens, your goal is, again, not to be equal, but to provide equity, to ensure that you're providing a fair approach and a custom approach towards ensuring your people can do their best work.
Andrew, as I'm listening, I'm sorry, finish your point. I'm sorry.
No, you're good. You're good. And just a reminder, leadership has to show support of DEI goals, not just at the beginning, but as we continue on with the journey.
Well, as you're talking through this implementation, I'm thinking, wow, what you're talking about here is real behavior change in an organization. And we know that humans do not like behavior change. And we know that in every organization, there are going to be some people who will drag their heels, they will ignore this, they will outwardly fight it. There are some people who jump right on board, other people wait and see who's going to win the war. How do you address the folks that don't buy into this?
A couple of things. Number one, start with why. Why are you not on board? Why are you against DEI? Why do you feel like it shouldn't be talked about in the workplace? And typically, when we get to that line of open discussion and talking, what we find is they have a misunderstanding of what the terms even mean, what DEI even means, which is why I always recommend starting with an intro to DEI type of training session to have common terminology. Or I find situations where people don't see the value in DEI. And that's where we can bring statistics to the table to say, okay, people perform better, organizations perform better when they have a diverse organization. People stay longer when they feel a sense of belonging. Well, how do you create a sense of belonging? Well, you do X, Y, and Z and incorporate it within your DEI strategy. So I would say typically if I run into that, I start with why, just to get a better understanding of why, and then I lead to the facts.
Great, thank you.
Yeah, great question. So those are the three main components of a DEI strategy: administering an audit, collecting that information, using that data to inform your strategic plan, which is finalized within the analysis and brainstorming phase. Then it's all about going after your goals and ensuring that they're SMART goals. And from a DEI follow-up perspective, this is just a yearly touch point to see, how are we doing? Are we tracking well against the goals that we aligned on? Do we need to administer a new DEI audit? I always recommend doing that yearly just to track progress, but ask yourself, do we need to send another one out to see how we're doing? You want to start tracking things like promotion and pay across different diversity cohorts to prevent bias. These are some proactive things you can do to ensure that you're looking through the right lens when it comes to DEI. You got to have metrics. What are we going after and why? A lot of times, a lot of DEI practitioners that I find, it's a lot of sit around a circle and hold hands and kumbaya. Well, there's a time for that, but there's also a time to ensure that the work we're doing and talking about when it relates to DEI connects to the business results. And I really want everyone on this group to understand that it is a business strategy. It's an HR strategy. It's a financial strategy to focus on diversity, equity, and inclusion. And it can lead to competitive advantage in the workplace. So that's the DEI roadmap. And to kind of bring us home, we're going to talk about crafting a compelling purpose and set of SMART goals as it relates to DEI. So as we dive right in, Simon Sinek, who's one of my favorite authors, he always talks about how you need to start with why, and how organizations oftentimes fail to be crystal clear on why they do what they do. And it's beyond just financial. It's beyond just making money. It's also about what will inspire action. What is the purpose, the cause, or belief? So when we talk about creating a purpose statement as it relates to DEI, the question you have to ask yourself is why? Why do you as the leader believe you should do something around DEI? And that's how you start. Understand that why, be clear on that why. When you're trying to craft your purpose statement for DEI, one of the first things I recommend leaders do is review your mission, vision, and values of your organization. If you want to open up another browser, I'll give you permission to do so and look up the mission, vision, and values of your organization. If you have it memorized, bonus points for you, but just think through that. What is the mission? Why does my organization exist today? Start there. Once you have that information in front of you, once you're thinking, okay, I understand what the purpose of my organization is, think about yourself, look inward. What are your personal core values? For me, it's simplicity, autonomy, and growth. And that's how I run my business. And I factor every decision that I make through those core values. If they don't align with my core values, I will not do it. Right? So as you're talking about crafting a DEI strategy, what is the purpose of your organization? What are your core, your personal core values? And then how do they align? How do they support each other? How do they connect? And I think this is very important because in order to not fall into this trap of focusing on DEI because it's popular, or it seems like the right thing to do, or because you don't want to be left out and everyone else is doing it, it has to be something deeper than that for your organization to understand that it's truly important and it should be valued. And the easiest way to start connecting those dots is to look at why your organization exists, what your values are, what the alignment is between those two. And then you want to think about what connects that with creating a sense of belonging. What connects that with valuing diversity of thought? We talked about all the value of having a diversity, equity, and inclusion strategy. Use your values, use your organization's purpose to figure out how you can connect with why you even want to approach DEI in the first place. Think about what phrases, what words stand out. Is there a sense of respect that you saw evident in the vision of your organization, your core values, and what you know comes with DEI? Maybe it's honesty, maybe it's integrity, maybe it's productivity. Right? Think about what phrases or words stand out in alignment between all three of those things. And then try to draft at least one sentence, no more than 3 sentences, I recommend. Just get notes on paper to say, well, what will be the purpose statement of your organization? And that's how you start with why. To share some examples with you, these are examples of different clients I've worked with that have come up with this. It could be 3 words. Maybe it's just to participate, collaborate, innovate. Our purpose within DEI is to ensure people feel comfortable enough to get in the game, to contribute, to work as a team, and to ensure that everything we do connects back to the business through innovation. It can be as simple as that. Maybe it's a sentence. Maybe your purpose is we strive to improve employee engagement by making our team members feel seen, heard, and valued. Maybe that's it for you. Or maybe it's, hey, our purpose is to encourage diversity of thought and foster a culture of belonging. If that's what a good DEI strategy should provide, maybe that's going to be our purpose statement. The key is to ensure that you have some level of direction, some level of why you're doing this work in the first place. That's one of the first steps for you as a leader when it comes to creating your DEI strategy. So I want to pause here before going to SMART goals and see if there's any questions on that.
Well, you know, Andrew, it's people struggle with purpose, questions and statements. They can get drawn out and dragged out and all that stuff. At Vistage, you know, one of our core values internally is respect the individual. And for us, that means respect the individual in all regards, who they are, where they come from, what their goals are, all the things that goes with that individual from the time they're a part of our community until at some point when maybe they're not. And again, it's one of those things that you mentioned. It's one thing to be able to say it, but it's another thing to see it and to really bring it to life is when you can cite specific examples of, in this scenario, we respected that individual. And then that then begins to radiate. So it's what you do, not what you say, that really matters.
Absolutely. So for Vistage, why approach DEI as a company? It aligns squarely with your values.
Of course it does.
Right? Diversity, equity, and inclusion in the workplace is respecting the individual and all the differences that come with that individual. It's literally synonymous with the values of the organization. And you'll be surprised how many organizations out there have values that actually speak specifically to the benefits of DEI. It's important for you as the leader to connect those dots and be able to articulate that. Let's talk about SMART goals: specific, measurable, attainable, relative, time sensitive. That's what we're talking about when we talk about SMART goals. As a DEI committee, they'll be the group that takes the data from the audit and sends the tentative goals to the leadership team for approval. But it's important for you as a leader to get the wheel turning on, what do you want to see? What makes sense to you based on the benefits that come with a diversity, equity, and inclusion strategy? Maybe that goal for you is to mirror the demographics of the community you serve by 2024. Maybe you realize that there's a Latino population in the area that you serve that is 13%, but only 2% of people in your organization identify as Latino. That might be one of your goals from a diversity standpoint. Maybe it's something specific around a KPI. So maybe it's turnover. Hey, I want to reduce turnover by 20% by the end of 2023. Well, how are we going to do that? That's where you start talking about your values and the approach that you want to take to ensure people feel a sense of belonging and have the resources and tools they need to grow and develop within your organization. Maybe a goal is simply, we need to get a cross-functional DEI committee together, and we need to do it quickly. It's August right now. Maybe we want to get a committee in place by December, right? And align on goals by February 2023. You can be an organization that's not diverse whatsoever, has not done anything at all when it comes to DEI, and you can be interviewing a candidate who comes from an underrepresented group and share that last bullet point with them. And that literally could be the difference for them saying, okay, they are trying to take action around DEI. And then lastly, committing to quarterly DEI training beginning in November. Maybe you just want to open up the conversation to have some courageous conversations in general. The key here is to take action. Right? Let your DEI strategy serve as your competitive advantage. Understand that change starts with you. If you do nothing, the status quo is what will continue to happen. You have to make up in your mind that diversity, equity, and inclusion is important, not just because it's the right thing to do, but because it has business implications if you apply it strategically and effectively within your organization. There's really three options you have. You do nothing with information. You go at it alone. Leverage the slide deck, leverage the material, and use it as a roadmap, or you can leverage a trusted consultant to go along this journey with you. My hope is that you just take action, period, and don't let this be something that falls on your ears and ultimately nothing happens within your organization to promote a culture that's more diverse, more equitable, and inclusive. So as we close things out, a couple of big ideas that I really want to make sure you all understand. The best DEI strategies prioritize equity, because that means you're being fair. That means you are approaching your team on an individual basis to ensure you're doing what matters most for them so they can do their best work and be most productive, and that you're being a fair organization. Secondly, the key is to foster a culture of belonging where diversity of thought is encouraged. We talked about that a few times today. So it's not just getting diversity for diversity's sake, it's getting diversity because businesses make better decisions when they have diversity of thought at the decision table. And then use metrics that matter, right? If something matters to you in the organization, you're going to measure it. The same applies to diversity, equity, and inclusion strategy. And then hold yourself accountable by being transparent and sharing your progress when it relates to DEI. And then lastly, senior leadership buy-in is critical for cultural change. It's truly a cultural change, as Joe was mentioning, right? This is a new way of really approaching work and saying we're going to literally incorporate DEI within our overall strategic plan. It's not something off to the side. It's something that interweaves with everything that we do, and senior leadership buy-in is critical for that. If you'd like to learn more about some of the topics that I speak around employee development and culture as a whole, or even diversity, equity, and inclusion, my book, The Circle of Leadership, is available on Amazon. You can also get it at my personal website, andrewadeniyi.com. If you'd like to stay connected with me, you can reach out. I'm on LinkedIn, on Twitter, Instagram _AA Solutions. You can also email me, AAA@andrewadeniyi.com. I do have an exclusive discount offer for all my Vistage people out there within the next 30 days. If you reach out to me via email, I'll be able to provide some more information on that discount. But truly, I really appreciate the time. And my hope for you all is that you just take action. Just do something. Thank you.
Andrew, thank you so much for your time, for your thinking, the thoughts you brought forward today. I really like the way you connected for so many levels, people that haven't started but need to, people that are somewhere on the journey, and people that may be further down the path, because the reality that keeps coming back to me is the demographics of our communities times the growth desires of our CEOs mean you can't ignore any demographic. And the way to be and to approach and to make sure you're taking advantage of every potential resource who could work for you is to have this inclusive, this DE&I strategy in place where people can feel that not only will they be respected, but they'll be included, they'll be incorporated, that sense of belonging that you spoke about.
Absolutely. Absolutely. You're spot on. Yeah. Census Bureau results show that I think by 2030 is the earliest prediction that it's going to be majority minority in America. So the time is now to start getting DEI up and running within your workplace.
Well, Andrew, thank you very much for your time. We look forward. I know so many of our groups are going to be excited to have you come in and speak to them going forward. And I thank you for your time and attention.
No No problem. Thank you for the opportunity. I appreciate it.
Right. And for our listeners, our attendees today, please join us on August 12th for a member roundtable to discuss hiring best practices. So we're going to get 3 or 4 members together and have them talk about what they're actually doing to improve their hiring practices. And on August 26th for a webinar on strategic pricing with our favorite pricing nerd, Casey Brown. You can register for those webinars or access the full archive of content at vistage.com/webinar. That's Vistage, Vistage, vistage.com/webinar. Thanks, everyone, and stay well.